This is Weekly Woman by Jubilance for PMS. Mary Hendra is a Los Angeles-based program director at Facing History and Ourselves, where she serves over 1,000 schools, reaching 500,000 students each year in Southern California. She recently started Move with Grace, a unique masterclass designed to find clarity and regain power in our world through stillness, creativity, and community. She's also a part of the leadership team of Elevate LA, an active facilitator for a Next Big Idea book group, and runs an amazing podcast book club where we first met. And she also spent time in what was then the Soviet Union with a family of 4 generations of women. Welcome, Mary. We're so excited to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's exciting to be here.
Thank you for being here. We just kind of start off with some more fun questions. So what is your favorite word in the dictionary?
The first word that comes to mind is the word flummoxed, which I discovered in college. And I think that I resonate with it all the time. Of that just complete oh, what am I going to do next?
I think that's such a good word. It kind of is like that onomatopoeia in a way, because you're just flummoxed.
And it's not used nearly enough, right?
Yeah, I should use that way more. And since you have this podcast book club, what is your favorite podcast for fun?
Yeah, just for fun. And one that I got hooked on early in my podcast listening is Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, which I started teaching about Harry Potter when it would not stay on my shelves as a teacher. And these 2 former divinity students from Harvard go through chapter at a time, and they connect to current events, and they talk about their personal stories, and it's just a really lovely podcast that is a great release for me when I need to step back from everything else going on in my world.
That's so cool. That sounds perfect for right now. And Harry Potter always. Yeah.
There's so much resonance in different ways, right? And controversy too. It's perfectly poised for really diving in deep and saying, okay, it's not a perfect world. That's a world, so we can learn from it.
Yeah, that makes complete sense.
Yeah.
And can you talk about what's your favorite podcast for your podcast book club or pod club?
Yeah, well, and which is hard because every time we meet, then women share the podcast they're listening to. So every month I get new podcasts that I want to listen to, right? But there was one time where one of the people who had been on a previous monthly call recommended the podcast Happiness Lab with Laurie Santos. And so a couple months later, we chose the theme of joy as our theme for let's explore podcasts that tell us about joy. And so I put that one in there, and it gave me an opportunity to listen to it. And I listened to an episode that was ditch the alarm clock, which is always a good plan for me. And so it was a really nice combination of the science behind and very practical ideas, and just compassion for being a human in this world.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay, we're all going to have to listen to that, especially now in this crazy time we're living in.
I think it's going to be a good one.
Yeah. Okay, what's your favorite place you've ever traveled?
I love traveling too. So this is, I already seeing these questions, my issue. I have so many interests, right? All these passions. I do love traveling. I will say though, probably my favorite is my mom grew up in Switzerland. And while I did not grow up in Switzerland, it has an extra special place in my heart, and the best chocolate store in the entire world.
So, oh my gosh, that's a reason to just live there forever.
Pretty much, yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. My sister is actually living there right now. She's in Dunigen, next to Bern. I don't know, okay. Where did your mom grow up?
She grew up in Zurich, and that is where the Springly main chocolate store is that I heartily recommend. My sister and I were also spent a summer there one year at a finishing school for young women.
Wow.
We did not do very well in the finishing school. In fact, got in trouble and, all sorts of things. I think we even broke one of the beds. But we did learn a little bit of German and a little bit of French, and made some good friends from other parts of the world.
Wow. Wait, I have so many questions. What do you learn at a finishing school?
Well, during the summer, they really focus more on language. So it was foreign language. During the school year, they tried to like sneak in some different things about like how do you present yourself as a young woman. Those ones didn't go over very well. I was in middle school, so I really just wasn't as interested in those ones. Those lessons didn't stick, but a little bit of German, a little bit of French.
I have only heard of those in a fairy tales, but that's incredible. Okay, so you're living in LA now. Can you talk about like what are some of your favorite parts of the city?
Yeah, and so one of the things I love about Los Angeles is that you can find everything here. I mean, there are so many different people, different activities, different practices, different beliefs. And I'm super curious. So I love finding new things. And whether it's environmental and great mountains, beaches, all of that, or like the cultural events, I find it all fabulous.
How is it feeling right now during like COVID? How has the city changed?
So now it's definitely a tough time, and I live in downtown Los Angeles. So downtown has been hard hit by the shifts in people's lives. So where there once was a lot of activity during the day, people are working from home, and there is a residential community in downtown, but it's not large enough to sustain all of the restaurants and retail. So there is much that is boarded up, and a lot of small business owners who are struggling during this time. So very different feel than the activity and vibrancy that it usually had a year ago.
Oh man. Yeah, because LA, like you said, it has everything. It has the beach and it has the mountains. And do you have a favorite restaurant that we should all like try and get to if we're in LA?
I do. My favorite restaurant in downtown LA is a little hole in the wall called Wood Spoon. It is a Brazilian restaurant, and
Ooh.
the owner, came from Brazil, is one of the sweetest women that I know, and she's a fabulous cook. And her Brazilian chicken pot pie was featured on the TV show The Best Thing I Ever Ate.
Huh.
It's really unique. What we also love, though, is just going there for they have great Brazilian grill. They have some vegetarian, options. And Natalia just creates a beautiful, compassionate space to bring people together.
What is it again? The wooden spoon?
It's called Wood Spoon.
Wood Spoon.
I think the website is woodspoonla.com. But
amazing. I have to try that pot pie now. It sounds so good. That's amazing. And what have you been up to during quarantine?
Sure. So I'm working from home as well. So I've been, at home doing things. I I find like a number of different things that really captivate my heart and keep me, doing different things. So I do love reading, particularly reading with my husband, and I can highly recommend the book Running with Sherman. Give that one a big shout out. It's like a donkey with a heart, and is a really great like human story and read aloud story if you have anybody you read aloud with. I've also found like for me during quarantine, it's been really important to stay connected with people. And you mentioned Elevate Network and the Pod Club. I really, trying to make sure that during this time I was connecting with other women and contributing, and it's been during that time that I like leaned into that and said like, let me help more and let me, help bring more events, because I know virtual events. I do a lot of virtual events anyway. And then my like sanity keeper throughout is is crafting and painting and being,
Wow.
like having different things that I create. And I'm not necessarily very good at any of them, but I do like creating. And there's something that is really calming for me about
Huh.
getting a ball of yarn or getting some beads or getting out. I paint with my hands as often as I paint with a brush, but
Wow.
that kind of thing.
What have you been painting? Do you just paint like landscapes or modern or
I
more abstract?
painting sounds so much more formal than what I use paint on stuff. It's
That's so
probably
cool.
the more accurate way to say it. And so like sometimes it's more images, but sometimes it's just like getting like paint into different places so that I can process things and think about things while I'm painting.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
Wow. That's really interesting. Oh, yeah. I found that like I didn't have any hobbies before this, and because I was just too busy, like never sitting down, but now I have 1,000. So I'm like, oh, let me try knitting. Let me try like beading.
We're all going to need bigger houses
I know.
for hobbies.
I'm still on the like knitting one square, but like I can't knit anything else but a square. So right now it's like a blanket. I did a scarf, but
my mother-in-law is the first one who taught me to work with yarn. She crocheted, and so she taught me how to crochet. And her first rule was only flat things. So,
that's where I'm at.
Yeah.
That's awesome. And since you're working from home, can you tell us a little bit about your professional journey? I know you've been at Facing History, you've been a teacher, and you're kind of moving into some different spheres. Can you talk a little bit about it?
Sure. And what else is like so my career has included like a really strong base in civic engagement and in education. Like from when I first graduated from college, and I worked for the County of Los Angeles, which actually just made history now that they, as of the last election, they are a fully female board of supervisors.
What? That's awesome.
Huge. I'm so proud of them and proud of us, right? But when I was there was one female supervisor, Gloria Molina. And so that's where I started, with really like a heart of serving my community and bringing people together, and then transitioned into teaching, in part through some volunteer work with the LA Commission on Assaults Against Women in their teen abuse prevention program, where tough topic, but really trying to say like we can have healthier relationships. Along the way became certified in mediation and facilitated victim offender mediations where there were youth offenders. And I will say, like, while I have not done that profession in a while or even as a volunteer for a while, the skills of really listening to people and bringing people together has been something I've used really throughout. And then I encountered Facing History when I was teaching. Another teacher told me about them. Facing History really tries to say like history is not inevitable, and the choices that we make as individuals make a difference. And that's such an important message for students, that it really was something important for my students in in South Los Angeles to hear it. And then as I went through, continued teaching, I at one point transitioned from using Facing History in my classroom in different schools to being on staff with Facing History. I've been there now for years.
Wow, amazing.
So, and I'll say, like, professionally, like, I am still 100% committed to civic engagement, to raising the voices of those who have been marginalized, and to education. But I also, a few years ago, I started just feeling a bit more impelled to be more visible in the world. Which I'll say, like, as someone who is a shy introvert, that was a strange thing. Like pushing myself a little bit out of my comfort zone, but it's been really interesting, and that's where Move with Grace came from.
Amazing. Can you talk a little bit about that? What is Move with Grace?
Move with Grace is my kind of creation and sharing a bit more of, in some ways, of how I move through the world. It's a recognition that we all face transitions that can raise our anxiety and stress. I think we've all seen that this year, like on a global level, like the things that have caused that transitions we did not ask for and seek. When I was starting to, think about this and talk about it, it was more in line with thinking of personal transitions, right? Whether it's a loss of a loved one that leads us to a different personal space, whether it's a professional transition with a career pivot, but those transitions that cause us to really like look within ourselves and make a new choice can sometimes feel really painful. And so what I had found for me was that tapping into not just verbal, not just like, okay, like journal about it. I'm like, yeah, like there's a blank page every day in my like, that was not sufficient to me. And I, like just recognize like we don't always think in words, right? Our thinking, our processing happens long before we have the words to articulate them. So how do we tap into that? Like and I think a lot of people talk about like the physical, or, sometimes going for a run helps, or doing yoga helps. And that is definitely like part of our kinesthetic, processing, but there's more than that. And I think we don't stop doing physical exercise when we realize we are not going to be a professional athlete. but many of us stop using paint, being visual, being aesthetic, when we're like, yeah, I'm not an artist. Right?
Yeah.
So Move with Grace changes that. Since we're not being artists, it's not about that. But let's use all the tools available to us when we are faced with these painful transitions so that we can make it through in a way that's true to ourselves.
That's interesting. So that's your part. That's like creativity, with using the paint to like understand these Okay. So can you talk a little bit about like those 3 words that you chose for Move with Grace: creativity, stillness, and community? What brought you to those specifically?
Yeah. So, and you're right, the creativity, like it's paint. I also do some things that's like more kinesthetic with paper and, collage and glue and, different things that way. And even just sometimes like manipulating our words rather than, just writing them in a linear fashion. So that is creativity, and it's a double use, because I've also found that like when my professional team is struggling to be more innovative, like these kind of things, strategies help build our creativity too. So it's creativity both in tool and in result.
That's
right?
so cool.
And then I will say community comes in part from seeing, the impact of relationships. And for me, that started in what was then the Soviet Union, as you mentioned in my bio, with really building a different kind of relationship between women, and then using that to think about how do I build community with my coworkers, with my community, as a teacher, with other teachers, as a leader in education, and it kind of dovetails with stillness. And I do want to read there's someone that I really enjoy what they write about stillness, and that's Ryan Holiday. And I think like when I'm thinking of stillness, this is the kind of definition I think of. So he wrote at one point that it includes to be steady while the world spins around you, to act without frenzy, to hear only what needs to be heard, that quiet moment when inspiration hits you, the ability to step back and reflect, making room for gratitude and happiness. So that's like my definition goes with that. And in like a quick term, I think for me, it's how do you find that sense of calm even in chaos? And between what I saw in the Soviet Union and this kind of like we create it, right? It's creating that sense of calm and chaos.
Wow. I think there's such a need for stillness right now. And I think for some of us, like we're experiencing it for the first time. I know like just living in New York City, it's like all about like this frenetic energy of like, how can you be doing a million things at once, but then to have to pause because of COVID, I think is a really
Yeah.
interesting concept. And like think about our lives and like what are we up to, what is going on, and to have that moment
Yeah.
I think is really interesting.
There's another quote. I don't have it in front of me, but that reminded me of the links to music, right? And
hmm.
I played music for many years. I played piano and then learned the guitar when I was in Russia. And and this quote says something to the effect of, um, like there's no sound, there's no music in the pause and the rest that you might see on a score, a musical score, but there is music in the making of it.
Huh.
And that sense of like when you think about those beautiful musical pieces, right, if there was not a rest, if there were not pauses in that music, we wouldn't be able to take in the rest of the gorgeousness of that music. And I
Yeah.
think sometimes it's parallel for us in our lives. Like, if we never have that pause, like we aren't our full selves. We aren't giving everything we can. People can't appreciate it if
hmm.
if we don't have that. It is part of life. It's not a withdrawal from life.
Wow, that's a really lovely view to think about. Yeah, having that fermata and you just have to like sit and wait. I guess that's what we're all in right now. But how can we take something away from that, which I think is
Yeah.
interesting in what you're saying? How can we like use this stillness to move forward or think about something in a different way, which is cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but what brought you to the Soviet Union? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, we need to go
How long
there.
were you there? You learned guitar? That's a long time.
so so I lived in I actually went 3 times. So the first time
Whoa.
was when I was in college. I went for 4 months. This was the first one how do you end up there? For me, it started in high school. So
Hmm.
I was in high school when Ronald Reagan was president. I know that's like putting me, but you already knew I was in that group because of the name Soviet Union. So my social studies teachers would echo what President Reagan said in calling it the evil empire. I have to say, like, I am not Russian. There are no Russian roots in my family that I have ever discovered. But there was something in my little heart that was like, I just can't believe that people are that bad.
Hmm.
I was a junior in high school at that point. I chose a college that had an abroad program where I could go to Russia, where I
Wow.
could learn Russian. I spent 3 years studying Russian so that when I went there, I would understand people in their own language. My communication got better over the time, but
Yeah.
my priority was understanding them, not being able to communicate my ideas. So it was all right. Um, and I chose a program, which this was perhaps one of the hardest things at that time. I chose a program where I would live with a family, not
Wow.
in the dorms. And at that point, because of the structure, right, in most cases there was a lot of separation. Now, we were pretty sure that one of our professors was also a KGB agent, and we knew that all of our mail got opened before it got to us. Like those were just
Wow.
things you lived with. But I like I lucked out. I lived with a family that was not trying to marry me to their son. That was a mother and daughter were the ones I lived with, and they were part of 4 generations of women. So grandmother and great grandmother were
Wow.
alive, but not in our home. Um, and so they, I was there. So they taught me how to play the guitar because at that point, like you didn't go out for entertainment. So like people would come over and you'd end up with 3 guitars and everybody's singing Russian folk songs and Beatles songs.
Wow.
Those were the most things, and a few American anti-war songs. I'm not sure how
Huh.
those came in, but that was the repertoire. And
Wow.
they taught me so much when I was there. And then I went back 3 years later when I was getting my master's degree in international public administration.
Amazing.
And at that point, I was working for the County of Los Angeles. So my master's thesis compared Russian and American local government. So I was
Huh.
there when Yeltsin was president. During the time I was there, the new constitution came out, so I got to study that for the country. I was also in the country when Yeltsin dissolved parliament and sent tanks rolling down the street.
Oh my gosh.
I fortunately, for long reasons, like we'd need another podcast, I had decided to, right before that, the weekend before, I had decided to move from Moscow back to St. Petersburg, which had gone from Leningrad to St. Petersburg. The family I had lived with the first time was in St. Petersburg. So I had decided to move back to them, and gratefully was there during the upheaval. The first shots fired as a result of the unrest were actually
Wow.
at the metro stop that I had walked to every morning in Moscow.
Oh my gosh.
And I instead was in St. Petersburg with amazing women who had gone through her own travails during the upheaval, but was safe at that time. And then 4 years later, I went back just for 3 weeks just to visit them. So.
Wow. That's amazing. And what were the biggest differences and similarities that you saw between the women that you were staying with?
I'll say one of the things for me that was a big contrast. I grew up like everything about my dad, right? Like my dad and I were very close, and so and I love my mother, I love my sister, but my dad and I were the ones that were the closest relation, and and he had raised us, both my sister and I, to know like we could do anything that a guy could do, right?
Yeah.
And that in some ways was the feminism, right, of that. And my mom was amazing. She broke so many glass ceilings professionally, right? So I had grown up with that. In the Soviet Union, what I saw was that the women were like, they had an entirely different definition of feminism, but they were such like bedrock power that with the country literally crumbling around them politically, economically. I mean, we had food shortages. I would stand in line for 2 hours to get into a grocery store,
Wow.
like toilet paper shortages. Like we had nothing on them, right?
Wow.
Remarkable, like what was passed off as toilet paper during that time, because it just wasn't available, right? It was the women in the society who would keep things together and keep families together, but keep the society moving through business deals over the kitchen table, and through like guiding people in what they should be doing next, or how they should prepare in like making their own like deals and functions, and even in things like the second time I was there, the city was shutting down water on a regular basis. Like your water in your entire like
Wow.
multiple block radius would be shut down for like 2 weeks, right? Like if it was one day, like okay, like you don't take a
Yeah.
shower that day. It was 2 weeks. So but you know what, like we would connect like my Svetlana was amazing. Like we'd invite ourselves over to another woman's house for tea and a shower.
Wow.
And it was like,
Ew.
this is how, like, the government may not be working right now, our infrastructure may not be working right now, but women were going to keep society moving in whatever ways were necessary.
Wow. That's amazing. It's so comparable to now, but so different too. Like, yeah, we have nothing on the toilet paper shortages we had.
We created that ourselves.
Yeah, I was just, oh. Yeah.
So you'd also asked about similarities. I mean, the differences were so stark there. I started with this, but I mean, similarities, like we really are all like people that are making those connections, right? And so my little high school heart was vindicated, right? The people were not bad, right? yes, there were political strife and political differences, but the individuals, right? When they invited you into their home, it didn't matter that there were shortages and, you couldn't get milk without a doctor's note. You had a child under the age of 3, and like, these different things. Like I never
Wow.
saw chicken in a store, but I saw it when I was invited over to people's homes, and that like connection, I see it in Elevate Network, right, where women are willing to just like help each other out. I see it in, in teaching, in education, right, with everything that teachers are giving for their students, um, and it was in my experience in Russia as well, all 3 times, of individuals who, like, that's what it means to be human, is you connect with people and you form things together and you care about each other.
Wow, that's amazing. And I think something that kind of ties together, something that we always ask about on this podcast is, what is your definition of womanhood? And you kind of gave a definition for just a human being, but what
Yeah.
would you say is womanhood?
So I would say, and I will shift it a little bit, but I would say like womanhood is powerful. Like womanhood is like the strength to be the connectors that form the fabric of a society and that keep us
Mm,
grounded, um, and allow us to move forward. And my shift is that I would say that's how I now define femininity,
mm,
and it is available to everyone.
yeah, that makes so much sense. Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah. Um, and if you had any advice to a woman that you just met on the street, and you just had like a few sentences to give her, what would you say to her?
Yeah, I would say to lean into who you are as a woman. I have definitely had experiences where, like, I was trying to either fit into a male definition of success,
Hmm.
or had male mentors who meant well, but their way of doing things is not my way of doing things. Um, and so, as an example, one of my first mentor teachers, like he's a coach too, right? So if a student was not behaving, he would say, like, drop and give me 20. Like, I have no zero like credibility to even say that phrase, like 20 what? I don't like,
Yeah.
like, but that's okay, right? And as I grew into who I was and how I could be in the world, um, it is absolutely possible to be both strong and feminine.
Mm,
And I think that's part of it's part of what we bring to the world. It's definitely part of what I try and do with Move with Grace, is really, giving that space for us to grow in community, for us to lean into who we authentically are and grow the strength from that to take action. Um,
mm.
so lean into who you are as a woman.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Mary. Is there anything else you'd like to add to our listeners?
Yeah, well, first off, I want to thank you again for inviting me to be on this podcast. This has been super fun to talk, and I really appreciate that. I probably like got us all sorts of off track from
Oh,
where
I
you
loved
thought we were
it.
going to go.
It was great.
um, but I will also say, I think for your listeners as well, I put together something that I think can help if you are like me, like flummoxed, and are at any point like in trying to deal with all of this stuff that we have, all of the anxiety and stress that comes from outside and internal, and have just had like one of those really bad days. I highly recommend like remembering you have all of these tools available. Your journal does not need to be just words. You can use different things, and if you need extra help in doing that, I put something together that I can give to your listeners.
Amazing. And how can they find out about your work?
There. So the resource I just mentioned, you can get, I created a tiny URL. So it's tinyurl.com/mkhendra. And you can also follow me on Instagram at mkhendra, which is where I try to have like some of my multi-passionate, like all of these different things that are me. So you'll see some randomness there, but I do pretty consistently try and share ideas for for journaling in different ways to be able to really like create more clarity for yourself and therefore take action so that you're not stuck.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mary. It was so lovely to have you on.
Thank you. Thanks again for having me.